according to my research, there have been 90 attempts to assassinate US presidents. And what we're going to look at today are the deaths of 4 presidents: Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, and Warren G. Harding, and the attempted assassination of Andrew Jackson. Why? What do we learn from them in relation to the Kennedy assassination? What I'm hoping to do is show how one particular theme runs through these cases, a bit like a lettering and a stick of rock. And it's how the US establishment seeks to cover up or dismiss any possibility of conspiracy unless, underline the unless, it suits them to the contrary. And we begin with the unsuccessful assassination of Andrew Jackson. Jackson is today regarded as one of the great presidents. His presidency ran from 1829 to 37. He is regarded as the first leader of the modern Democrat Party. His presidential reign was dominated by one big issue: whether or not to renew the charter of the Bank of America, which had huge ramifications for America's economic development. Jackson wanted to abolish the bank. It was a bitterly divisive issue, one which turned friends into enemies. One such former friend of Jackson's was Senator George Poindexter of Mississippi. On January the 30th, 1835, Jackson was attending a funeral in Washington when a young Englishman named Richard Lawrence walked up behind him and pulled the trigger of a pistol. It misfired. So Lawrence then pulled the trigger of a second pistol. That misfired too.
Look down the barrel.
Well, the odds of this happening have been estimated at 125,000 to 1, and have been put down to moisture caused by dampness in the air. Apparently, that model of pistol was prone to that. Lawrence was arrested, declared insane, and spent the rest of his life in an asylum. There seems very little doubt that he was mad. He believed, apparently, that he was really our King Richard III, and that Jackson's economic policies were preventing him from earning his living as a house painter. Such is the standard story. Read any book on crime or assassinations, and Richard Lawrence is the epitome of the mad lone assassin, the prototype for Lee Harvey Oswald. Must be true, says so in the Warren Report. And that's why it's gone down in history. I've been reading and researching into assassinations for nearly 50 years before I discovered that this was not necessarily the truth. In fact, people at the time thought that Lawrence was acting on behalf of others. Who said so? Well, President Jackson himself said so. His former vice president, John Calhoun, he named as the prime mover. Calhoun was actually forced to go to the lengths of denying it in Congress. Jackson also named Poindexter, who a few months earlier had employed Lawrence to paint his house. Poindexter also vehemently denied it, but was unable to convince people back in Mississippi, and was denied re-selection as a senator by the Mississippi legislature. In those days, I should add, US senators were not elected by popular vote, but they were selected by state legislatures. Jackson's enemies were sufficiently under pressure to put forward their own counter-theory, which was the assassination attempt was a put-up job to win sympathy for Jackson. May have been. On the other hand, Calhoun, Poindexter, and other enemies of Jackson may have thought that the loony Englishman was a good, useful tool, or Lawrence might have been a lone would-be assassin. That's not the issue. The point is that, like most other people, I had never heard that it might have been a conspiracy. I suspect that most of you today are hearing it for the first time. The point is that by 2044, when the same length of time would have elapsed since the Kennedy assassination, the relentless Oswald lone assassin propaganda by the establishment is likely to have similarly succeeded. And people will not know of the doubts surrounding the Kennedy assassination. And there is a much nearer home case which emphasises the point. In 1843, a young man named Daniel Macnaghten attempted to assassinate the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. Macnaghten mistook Peel's private secretary, Edward Drummond, for him and killed Drummond instead. Macnaghten was judged to be insane and shunted off to an asylum for the rest of his life. Suppressed at the time was evidence that Macnaghten was not a lone nut, but a dedicated revolutionary acting in concert with others. Today, 173 years later, few know, fewer care. That is how the establishment wants the Kennedy Association to be viewed. We move on to the 1848 presidential election. The backcloth to the election was the growing nationalism of the southern states. Many northern politicians believed that there was a deliberate southern conspiracy to retain power for their own interests. Amongst those who believed this was a young politician whom we shall hear more of, Abraham Lincoln. In 1848, the Whig Party chose as its candidate Zachary Taylor. Taylor had ideal qualifications as a hero of the recent war with Mexico. For the South, he seemed like the dream candidate. Not only a war hero, but from the state of Louisiana in the Deep South, and a slave owner. In 1850, the first secessionist crisis arose, with the southern states threatening to secede, just as they did 11 years later. Had they done so, it probably would have changed the course of history, because the North was nowhere near as strong in 1850 as it became by 1861, after 11 years of massive immigration from Europe and an unparalleled growth of industry in the North. The South expected Taylor to be on their side. They received a very huge shock. Taylor opposed any extension of slavery and vowed that if the South succeeded, he would personally lead troops against them and execute their leaders. On July the 4th, Taylor attended an Independence Day party. A US senator at the same party noted how healthy the president looked beneath the canopy. But shortly afterwards, he became unwell, and on July the 9th, he died. The death certificate says gastroenteritis. So what did he eat at the party? Various sources say cherries, cucumber, cabbage, bread and milk, coupled with spending 2 hours in the hot sun. Well, actually, he wasn't out in the hot sun, he was under a canopy. And the very things which are supposed to have made him ill are exactly the foodstuffs which the medical profession today says are exactly what we should be eating. Certainly true in my case. On the other hand, gastroenteritis has the same symptoms as arsenic poisoning. According to the press, Taylor claimed on his deathbed to have been poisoned. In 1991, Taylor's body was exhumed and examined for arsenic. Arsenic was found. And now, as usual, the establishment press took over. No, the arsenic wasn't there in sufficient quantity to cause death. I.e., everything perfectly all right, no assassination, no conspiracy, all go back to sleep. These, of course, are the same people who've been peddling the Oswald lone assassin theory for the past 53 years. For an excellent article on the Taylor case, incidentally, I recommend Tony Sebbert's The Strange Death of Zachary Taylor, which you'll find on the internet. Sebbert writes, the Taylor story shows how silly stories can become accepted facts through relentless repetition, even though they don't make any sense. A process which we have seen successfully practiced by the right-wing propaganda machine over and over again. for milk and cherries, read single bullet theory. And just like the single bullet theory, there is also a hole in the establishment's not enough arsenic theory. The researchers had simply examined the amount of arsenic in a whole hair when they should have been looking at concentrated amounts of arsenic in a cross-section of the hair from near the scalp. And another comparison. Just like the TV documentary, which claimed to have emulated the trajectory of the single bullet, well, in fact, in that documentary, the bullet comes out from Kennedy's chest. So the New York Times and Washington Post said Taylor's arsenic came from his embalming fluid. He wasn't embalmed. Tony Sebbott has this to say, and I quoted him because what he says is very appropriate. Why are they still covering up Taylor's assassination? And why is the compliant media still covering Freed's murderers? If Taylor was assassinated, then we have been lied to for 166 years. What else have they lied about? You don't need to answer that one, do you? 11 years after Zack Taylor's death, the South did secede and America did go to war. 650,000 soldiers did not return. One of the last to die was the Union's Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln, assassinated on Friday, April the 14th, 1865, by a well-known actor, John Wilkes Booth. By garish coincidence, Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth, had once written a letter threatening to assassinate Andrew Jackson. Yeah? By a much happier coincidence, not long before John Wilkes gunned down Lincoln, his elder brother, Edwin Booth, prevented Lincoln's son, Robert, from falling under a train. That's not so well known. Well, Lincoln assassination is dismissed in the Warren Report as Booth having conspirators of assault. There was nothing of assault about it. Louis Payne, David Herold and George Atzerodt were all hanged alongside Mary Surratt as conspirators of the Lincoln assassination. Mary was probably innocent, by the way. At the same time, Booth was shooting Lincoln. David Herold was showing Payne the way to the home of US Secretary of State William Seward, you know, the man who bought Alaska, we heard about this morning. Once there, he stabbed Seward and several members of his household, happily all recovered. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt was supposed to be murdering Vice President Andrew Johnson, but lost his nerve and got drunk instead. That's the problem with assassinations, you just can't get the staff. Historians have been debating whether there was a wider conspiracy in the Lincoln assassination ever since. I'm not going to go into that. Instead, let's concentrate on this conspiracy which we do have, and which the establishment would prefer did not exist. In fact, today, few people have even heard of it. Most know that Booth killed Lincoln, but they assume he was one of the establishment's parade of convenient lone nutters, like Richard Lawrence, like Charles Guiteau, like Leon Czolgosz, like John Schrank, Giuseppe Zangara, Oswald, John Hinckley. Payne, Herold and Atzerodt have been very largely airbrushed from history, a bit like those photographs which show Lenin addressing the masses with Trotsky at his side. When Stalin got into power, the photos were reproduced without Trotsky. When they are mentioned, the establishment and its media have clearly learnt from Richard Lawrence and Britain's Daniel McNaughton. Payne is portrayed as a Neanderthal psychopath, Herold a simpleton, and Atzerodt a pitiful alcoholic non-entity. Another issue, which rarely gets a mention, concerns Andrew Johnson, who stepped into Lincoln's shoes. Lincoln won in 1860 because the opposition to him fragmented the three other main candidates. In 1864, minus the South, he faced a straightforward fight with the Democrat Party, which wanted to end an unpopular war with a negotiated peace. Lincoln, therefore, needed to gain Democrat votes. So, for his running mate, he chose virtually the only senior pro-union, pro-war Southern Democrat available, who was Andrew Johnson. On April 15th, 1865, Johnson thus found himself a Democrat president presiding over a Republican cabinet. They fell out big time. In 1868, Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives for high crimes and misdemeanours. To wit, he had conspired to assassinate Lincoln. A majority of the House voted to impeach him, but they failed by a solitary vote to gain the 2/3 majority needed. So what was the House saying? That there was a wider conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, led by Johnson? No. They were simply using the assassination of Lincoln as a ploy to get rid of Andrew Johnson. In other words, when there's a conspiracy, when it suits the political establishment. They are then quite prepared to declare something a conspiracy if it gets the desired result. And I ask, what sort of morality and integrity is this? Can you trust anything political establishments tell you? Chronologically, our next assassination should be James Garfield in 1881. In this case, I know of no evidence to refute the depiction of Gatun as a megalomaniac loony. Of course, a few years ago, I would have said the same thing about Richard Lawrence and Daniel McNaughton. But in the absence of anything contrary, we'll pass over it. The assassination of William McKinley 20 years later shares one thing in common with Garfield's. Both were shot in the abdomen, and even by the standard of that day, had they received competent medical treatment, they would have recovered. But for the moment, I want to pass over McKinley and leave him till last. The end of World War I did not leave America with a feel-good factor. There was high cost of living, high unemployment, dissatisfaction with wartime controls, particularly amongst ordinary people, prohibition, which meant you couldn't legally have a relaxing drink after a hard day's work. Pygmy issues of satisfaction were matched by pygmy politicians. The 1920s America was an era of political non-entities in the two big parties. The Democrats in 1920 took 44 ballots to come up with a nothing candidate named James Cox. That paled into insignificance 4 years later. After 102 ballots, they still hadn't found a presidential candidate. And there was a lovely story, I couldn't resist not getting this one in, that the chairman of the Democrat Party told his committee, either we find a candidate or we move to a cheaper hotel. That concentrated their minds wonderfully, because in the next ballot they actually did get a candidate. A guy called John Davis, who, like Cox, sunk without trace at the election. In 1920, the Republicans settled on a compromise candidate themselves named Warren Gamel Harding. His selection gave rise to the term smoke-filled room, although apparently it was actually invented by a journalist. What wasn't invented was his own party's view of Harding. Nobody thought him being anywhere near presidential calibre. But to quote the Attorney General in his administration, Harry Doherty, Harding, quote, looked like a president. He was overwhelmingly elected in November 1920 on a very low turnout. He presided over one of the most corrupt administrations in US history. It was epitomised by what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, in which government oil reserves were being illegally sold off, under the aegis of the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who subsequently ended up in prison. In August 1923, Harding embarked on a strenuous presidential trip to Alaska. While he was there, apparently I think August is about the only sort of month in when there's any form of sunshine in that story. Anyway, that's just, while he was there, he received a coded message which upset him. It is believed to have been a warning that his corrupt administration was about to be exposed, because he remarked, "I can handle my enemies, but God protect me from my friends." The latter is actually believed to have been, sorry, I'm having difficulty with to be directed at the Attorney General, Doherty, whom it is believed Harding intended to fire on his return to Washington. But Harding then collapsed. He was immediately given the all clear because the presidential party then proceeded to San Francisco. But here, he complained of feeling tired and collapsed again. Reports claimed that he had had food poisoning, good old Stanboy. But then he was diagnosed as having pneumonia. He rallied, but on August the 23rd, while he was alone with his wife, he had a violent convulsion and died. The mystery of Warren G. Harding's death remains to this day. He was 58, had seemed to be in very good physical condition. There was no autopsy. It is claimed that his wife, Florence, refused to allow one. But the fact is that the president's wife has no more power than any other American wife to refuse an autopsy. And his not having one was blatantly illegal. Was he poisoned? Once again, fingers have been pointed at Harding's wife. Harding was well known for his extramarital affairs. It was whispered